series of incredible workshops that we believe will help all of us learn more about advocacy in the fundraising and nonprofit space, how we can best support and further our nonprofit missions by informing and educating our elected officials and continuing to do the good work that we all do. So I'd like to especially thank our Legislative Action Day Committee, our panelists and moderators who have been troopers throughout this completely reimagined event and have really created some wonderful content that will serve all of our needs. I'd also like to thank United Ways of Texas, One Star Foundation, Philanthropy Southwest for their support of this event, and our Austin AFP board. And after this series is over tomorrow, I hope you all will join us for a free virtual luncheon sponsored by our Education and Programs Committee at 11:30, and I'll put the link in our chat. Philanthropy Meets Policy, Using Your Voice and Your Gifts to Create Change. So that's another addition to a full Legislative Action Day series over the course of the next 2 days. Thank you again for being with us today and for the wonderful work that you do across Texas. I'd now like to introduce our Austin AFP chapter president, Kristen Campbell, for a few brief remarks, and then we'll begin our first session. Kristen.
Thanks, Catherine, and hello, everybody. Thank you again for being here. I'm Kristen Campbell, and I am the Chief Advancement Officer at Ronald McDonald House Charities of Central Texas, and also, as Catherine said, serve as the president of our local AFP chapter. I am so excited about the content that all of us are going to get to learn more about over the next 2 days, and find it particularly poignant that we are gathering in the middle of what has not been a boring Texas legislative session, or just in general, not a boring political year. We know as fundraisers and as nonprofit professionals how important advocacy is on behalf of the people that we're serving. And I really believe that it is our role and our privilege to be involved in advocacy at the local, state, and national level, however we can be. It would be, it's a privilege to look away from that and to not be involved. And so it's our duty to be actively engaged in the conversations that are happening in our cities and towns across the state of Texas and beyond. Sometimes that might not be comfortable, but I think that it's our role. And as fundraisers, we have such power in our voices to make a difference and to help convince people and to push change forward. So thank you all for being here. I know that it's a small but mighty group that are participating. I know lots of people are going to be tuning in later to watch the recording. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to Catherine and her committee and to the organizations participating today. We really appreciate it. And now I'll turn it back over to Catherine.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. We are going to kick off session 1 now, and this will be led. Our moderator is Angie Castilleja. So Angie, off to you.
On mute. Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone. I am happy to serve as our moderator for our first session. I am Angie Castilleja. I work with the YMCA of Austin. I serve as our state director for our Texas Youth and Government program, which is a civic engagement program that I have been leading for the past 5 years, and have had an opportunity to engage in advocacy work. It's still learning as I go, and so I'm happy to be joined here by David Lofye and Marie Arcos, who will be leading our panel today. So let me introduce Marie Arcos, Government Relations Officer with YMCA. Marie Arcos is a native Houstonian and third-generation Texan who has been with the YMCA of Greater Houston since 2001. She currently serves as the Chief Government Relations Officer and is tasked to build and strengthen partnerships with private and public organizations with the community, and promotes our YMCA national and state legislative agendas. Her career with the YMCA began in 1996 as a volunteer board member, then became an executive director for one of 36 YMCAs in Houston. She was the first Latina in that role and the only Hispanic executive director in the organization at that time in 2001. Marie received her Master of Social Work from the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work in 1997, specializing in political and community organizing. Committed to ensure equity in education and health for Houston children and families, she currently serves on the local boards of Harris County Public Health Departments, Healthy Living Matters Executive Committee, Avenue CDC, and the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. Marie volunteers with Spindletop Charities and is a senior fellow with the American Leadership Forum Class 47. Marie loves everything Houston, supports her Hispanic heritage through the arts and education, and can often be found at community events and exploring the hidden gems around town. Also my pleasure to introduce David Lofye, founder and principal of David Lofye Consulting. David is a strategic public affairs consultant based in Austin who helps organizations maximize their impact through policy change. Prior to launching David Lofye Consulting, David spent 12 years in the Livestrong Foundation, where he most recently served as Vice President of Mission Strategy and Advocacy, and was responsible for the advancement of the foundation's legislative and policy priorities that benefits people living with cancer. Earlier in his career, David was the Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for a member of Congress in Washington. He also served as a professional staff member on the House Science Committee and as a law clerk on the Senate Judiciary Committee. During this time on Capitol Hill, David helped successfully advance a number of legislative priorities in the areas of transportation and infrastructure, water resources and the environment, aviation, space, and agricultural trade. David earned a BA in political science from Indiana University and a JD from the University of Texas School of Law. He is a member of the District of Columbia and Supreme Court Bar Associations, and David lives in Austin with his wife and daughter. So thank you both, Marie and David, for joining us, and I will kick off our presentation with you, David.
Well, thanks so much, Angie, and really happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation. Thrilled to see so many organizations that are really interested in this intersection between philanthropy and advocacy, and really want to thank the Association for Fundraising Professionals for making Legislative Action Day a priority through this programming. As Angie said, I've currently a public affairs consultant working with nonprofits, spent some time at the Livestrong Foundation, helping them kind of build up, establish, and maintain their advocacy and government relations program. And then had worked on Capitol Hill for a number of years and was on the receiving end of a number of different advocacy and policy campaigns from organizations. And so have seen this work from a number of different angles. So looking forward to this Advocacy 101 conversation today. Maybe we could go to the next slide. One of the things I wanted to make sure we addressed during this Advocacy 101 conversation is this misconception that I often hear from nonprofits that they're not allowed to advocate or lobby, and it's actually quite the opposite. IRS regulations clearly allow nonprofits to engage in advocacy activities, including lobbying. As your organization is setting out to do this work, it's important to have a good understanding of the IRS rules and regulations, like the insubstantial part tests and the 501H election, which are ways that the IRS has kind of, allowed nonprofits to measure and track their lobbying activities to ensure they're staying within the rules. And to make sure that they're able to report these amounts on the 990 form every year. And since this is Advocacy 101, I'm not going to get into the weeds of these the nuances here, but the good news is there are a lot of great organizations out there that have resources for nonprofits to help them advocate. And one that I want to make a particular mention of is the Boulder Advocacy Initiative of the Alliance for Justice. I use their resources quite often. They have a lot of tools and resources on their website. And I know Natalie Austin-Fort from the Alliance for Justice will be speaking on one of our panels later in the series. And so, just know that there are a lot of great resources out there. And so, you can feel comfort in that. Maybe we can move to the next slide. So now that we've established that nonprofits can advocate, I want to just kind of ask the question, why should nonprofits advocate? And I guess these got kind of, the text got a little messed up on this one. But, I'm a firm believer that nonprofits should be advocating in order to maximize the impact that they're having in carrying out their missions. And advocacy can take a number of different forms. Kristen was saying, you know, I think for every organization, it can look a little different. And so when I was at the Livestrong Foundation, you know, working with our public health colleagues, we often use this social-ecological model to help us frame our thinking around Livestrong's kind of role in the cancer space. And while I think this is largely a public health framework, I think it's helpful for us to kind of use to think about how nonprofits can engage in advocacy. And so, you know, there are different versions of this framework out there. I've seen, you know, 4 levels versus 5 levels, but, you know, the basic idea behind this model is that when addressing large issues, you know, there's kind of an interplay between kind of at the individual level versus the relationship level, at the community level, and then, you know, societal factors, which kind of often, you know, comes into play with advocacy. And so certainly at the individual level, things like, you know, someone's age, education, and income are key factors. You know, with relationships, you know, peers, friends, family members. At the community level, you know, schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, places of worship. And then, you know, societal factors, things like social policies and government systems. You know, the theory here is that, you know, in order to move the needle on an issue, it's necessary to act kind of across all of these levels at the same time. And so, you know, I think there are a lot of great nonprofits out there that are doing a lot of work at the individual or community level, but maybe aren't engaged in the policy work or advocacy work. And so, you know, I think this model kind of makes the case when trying to move the needle on a lot of this work, that a comprehensive approach is more likely to produce a desired outcome over time, as opposed to kind of, you know, addressing these issues at any kind of individual level. Can we move to the next slide? So, you know, what does this look like in reality? And here's kind of a real world example from my time when I was at the Livestrong Foundation. You know, this is kind of how we described our work. And so, you know, we had a toll-free cancer helpline to when we were, you know, helping individuals, friends, family members with a cancer diagnosis. You know, this was kind of our Livestrong navigation work, the cancer support services. We also offered community programs and grants that were designed to help people affected by cancer through, you know, investments in nonprofits, schools, hospitals, cancer centers at the local level. But at the same time, we were also working to fix the system to engage decision makers in advocating for policy change related to cancer policy. And so, you know, I often used to say, you know, our work through cancer support services and community programs in many ways was kind of a Band-Aid on a broken system. And so I think we all know as fundraisers, it's, you know, it's difficult to sustain these types of programs through philanthropy alone. And so I think for our organization and others, it was important for us to engage in advocacy to, you know, change the root causes of these issues through systems change. And so, as an example, we were advocating in support of the Affordable Care Act to improve, you know, better access to healthcare and other insurance protections for cancer survivors. And so, at the same time, you know, our work with individuals and at the community level was also kind of providing data and those personal stories that are so important for decision makers to hear when trying to, you know, how to show that they're, you know, these are real world impacts and affect people on a real world basis at the local level. So can we move to the next slide? Thanks. So, you know, once an organization decides to get more involved in advocacy, or maybe an organization's been involved in advocacy for a while and wants to kind of hit the pause button and reevaluate your work, you know, I think, you know, where's a good place to start? And I think, you know, a lot of organizations want to dive right in to the legislative arena and get involved, you know, at the Capitol around, you know, support or opposition to bills that impact their mission. And that's certainly fine for a number of organizations. But, you know, I often advise organizations to take a step back and think about this work from the 30,000 foot view first. And so kind of at a high level, you know, what are your organization's core policies and what kind of change do you want to see in the world? You know, what policies are critical to your mission and the people that you serve? I almost think about it in terms of like a candidate's campaign platform as opposed to kind of a legislator's legislative priority list. And so, it's more focused on high level change versus bill numbers, which often comes later, specific pieces of legislation. And so I worked with the Austin Parks Foundation on this process, and so I think these are kind of high level policy platform titles, and these kind of led to a deeper dive kind of position papers on each of these topics. These were of particular importance to the Parks Foundation, and so I think these can be a kind of an important tool for organizations. It can be kind of a guiding document for your leadership, board, and other supporters. It can also kind of provide some guardrails for your organization when new opportunities come your way. When I was at the Livestrong Foundation, we would often get asked to get involved in kind of environmental issues as they relate to cancer. And I think having gone through the exercise of developing a policy platform, we were able to have those conversations as an organization. What areas do we want to focus on? And that helped us kind of stay in our lane when we would get pulled in different directions and asked to weigh in on different policy priorities. That being said, that the policy landscape shifts all the time, and so it's important to have your kind of priority set, but also have some flexibility, I think, to be able to be nimble and adjust as things change. I also think it's helpful to go through this exercise to help with prioritization. We all know nonprofits have limited bandwidth, and so to be able to prioritize and decide which policies does our organization want to play a leadership role on, which policies do we want to maybe work in partnership with others, work within coalitions, and then maybe there are some policies where we just want to endorse or lend our name or write a letter of support. I think these are all important decisions and conversations to have, because I think organizations just quickly realize that they can't do it all, and so to be able to go through this exercise and prioritize, I think is really important. Can we go to the next slide, please? So once you've determined your policy priorities, how do you begin to advance this work and have an impact? And I think these three components are essential to any strategic approach to advocacy, and these are going to obviously look different for different organizations. Direct advocacy and lobbying. How do you plan to directly engage with decision makers? Not every organization needs to go out and hire a contract lobbyist. In fact, I would say that most shouldn't and most don't. But I think every organization has key individuals, whether they be in the leadership, executive directors, board members, who can engage in this work, and I think would be excited to engage in this work. Certainly grassroots support is also key when trying to advance advocacy priorities. And so, when thinking about this for new organizations that are just kind of getting involved in this work, certainly thinking about the people you serve, grantees, community partners, fundraisers, I think these all would be good places to start when you're thinking about who could be your best advocates. And so it's really important that lawmakers, decision makers hear these personal stories to put faces on policy issues. And so, I also think it's important to start small and grow over time. When I started this work with the Livestrong Foundation, our first lobby day in DC on Capitol Hill, we had 12 advocates. Over time that grew into lobby days where we brought in 250, 300 people, and we had grassroots trainings of 1,000 people and local community events as well. And so don't feel like you have to start big. I think it's important to start small, do it well, and grow over time. Advocacy messaging. I think this is kind of the third leg of the stool that a lot of organizations often neglect, but I think it's really important, and most successful advocacy organizations, I think, have integrated this into their work. And so this involves everything from social media, traditional media, outreach, advocacy messaging, marketing. I think these are critical components of a successful advocacy campaign. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Perfect. And so just in summary, I think there are a number of keys to success to remember. Hopefully, if you take anything away from today, just knowing nonprofits can, and in my opinion, should be advocating. The programs that your organizations are doing, you're on the front lines and you understand the needs and the gaps and, where the policy changes need to happen. And so those, in my mind, should be informing your advocacy efforts. Going through that exercise of setting policy priorities, I think, is an important task, but, allow yourself some flexibility, stay nimble. The policy landscape is often shifting and changing. And so understand the landscape, but also, be able to adjust as needed. And then, prioritize. Where do you want to lead? Where do you want to partner? Where do you want to maybe endorse and support? And continually evaluate your efforts and adjust over time. I think in many ways, advocacy principles are very similar to development principles. I mean, we're in advocacy meeting with decision makers, making asks, engaging our grassroots supporters, using compelling messaging to talk about, our organizations, our needs, the policies that we support. And so I think these are all kind of helpful messages that can be used when trying to sell the need to engage in advocacy with your leadership, your board members, and your supporters. And so thanks again for the opportunity to visit with you about this, and look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I failed to mention that at the end of our second presentation by Marie, we will then have some time for questions. So if you all are thinking of questions, feel free to put those in the chat, and I will grab those, and we will then ask our presenters those questions. So thank you, David, again, for that high-level view of advocacy. And we're going to segue to Marie, who will now give us some real-world examples of how to put that into action. So off to you, Marie. Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome, everyone. And this is just the best part of my job, I believe, is to be able to share some best practices and practical experiences in the work that we do. And I love that David was able to share, again, all of the components that we have to make sure that we have in place through our planning, and many of our organizations that we work with and for. We want to make sure that they've done this particular piece and knowing what their priorities are, and creating that roadmap on what we want to share with folks. So I'm going to really talk about, in the diagram that he shared was, those three stools, or the legs of the stools. I'm going to really focus in on the grassroots piece, and specifically about how we can engage our board or volunteers in the storytelling that I call storytelling, and that we also know as advocacy. So, for the YMCA, I'll speak about that a bit, and then kind of interlude some of the other nonprofits boards that I serve on, in the way that we do the same sort of principles and engaging our board at, me as a volunteer. We want to make sure that I'm prepared as a volunteer to help share the story with influencers. And most of the time when we're doing advocacy work, it's not always with our elected officials, but it's also with their constituents, and also their donors that help get them into positions. And so we want to make sure that we're covering the people that our elected officials are representing, as well as the folks that help get them there. And again, all of those folks have the same thing in common, and that's the district for the betterment of people. So at the Y, we do this by talking about youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility. And the reason I show this slide is because you have to, just like we do, and there'll be a lot of alignments and that I share that are the same with the principles in philanthropy and fundraising, is we want to share the story, but we also have to be a good active listeners, and do our homework ahead of time to know what the priorities are for our elected officials that we may be visiting with, and also doing some quick little research and looking up their name. You can Google them. We can go into their homepage that's easily accessible on the website, and we can find out what committees they serve on, or what types of things they're most interested in. If it's a specific policy that you want to talk to them about, you can see if they supported other issues around that. And so there's a little bit of legwork, just like we do in terms of going to talk to a potential donor. We do a little background check on them. So that's the same thing that you'd want to do in this particular instance. And then, so when we, kind of when we talk about advocacy and lobbying, and David said it best, right? There's no reason why nonprofits can't do lobbying, but we steer away from it sometimes because it sounds so intimidating. And so I just, kind of share this particular piece because basically we're just informing when we talk about, we're advocates. And that word is a big word, right? We want to take a position on something, or we want to share education and information about things that are relevant to the community. So again, it's just the basics of storytelling, educating people about what your organization does, what the priorities are that relate back to the social issues in our society, in our communities, or in our state, or even our nation. The advocacy piece is, articulating the cause that appeals directly to our public policymakers and officials. So again, that's knowing, the plan, knowing your data, being able to share what your organization is doing to advance the work in those particular areas. And then mobilizing is when we are able to create the plan, and we talk about how are we going to get that message out. Do we want to talk to our elected officials? Do we want to talk at what level? And then we take the best people. And one of the things in mobilization that I love best about working with the YMCA is that we have our YUSA government relations team, and they organize the National Advocacy Days where we go up to DC and we visit with our representatives. But what they encourage us to do is to make sure that we bring our CEO, but most important, that we bring our youth change makers, or the youth that are in youth and government, some of our youth leaders and board members, and then a staff person such as myself that can help navigate and organize. So the mobilization is really important. You don't always have to do this by yourself. And I know that when you've done calls before on donors, sometimes you bring the executive director, or you might bring a program staff that can help bring the story to life. And so we want to make sure that we're doing that. And then, when I started, really delving into going up to DC or going up to the state during Ledge and doing advocacy days, whether it was with the Y or one of the other organizations, they're like, Marie, we want you to share the story and the impact around one of the particular topics. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't know what to say to them. They're powerful. And they're just like, calm yourself, take a breath, and tell me why you volunteer for this organization. What's important to you? And then you step back a little bit, and they said, that's what I want you to do with this elected official or the person that you'll be meeting with. Just share with them. Don't worry about making a mistake. Share with them the impact that your organization is doing, and then make sure that you're leading with an ask from them. And then on this particular, so it's been a little bit of time just talking about mobilizing and how to get in there. But, again, you want to have in the back of your mind or on your note card or your leave behind that you are talking about a specific public policy or an issue, stating how your organization has, we're for it, we're against it, this is what we want to do. And then again, that ask, and they're going to want to know. They're going to expect you to be asked, they know you're there to ask about something or for something. And so you want to make sure that you do make that ask and don't leave without it. And if you do, they probably will ask you, so thank you for coming in. What would you like us to do? What would you like the representative to do? So anyway, so always be, but before you come, make sure that you know what you're going to walk away and ask them for, and don't be afraid to do that. And the next slide. And here's some examples in Houston where on the very large scale on the Fed side, and then also more locally. And one of the very interesting dynamics this year that I'm encountering is because of COVID and the pandemic, and we're navigating the federal relief dollars, I'm working in 2 realms right now. So we're monitoring and watching what's happening last year on the federal level. And then we would typically gear up for the legislation timeframe that we're in right now. And then the Fed stuff would kind of go to bed, and then we would focus mostly on the state. This year, in 2021 right now, we are navigating both. We're navigating those federal dollars, watching how the laws are being passed that are going to affect our nonprofits and how they come down to each of our states and cities. So we're monitoring that, and then we're also monitoring what's happening in the state ledge. So it's a very peculiar year. A lot of the things that you normally would encounter are not happening, and so being able to share the story, you know, when we were preparing for legislation in the state here, most people were telling us, oh, it's going to be easier for you to get access to the elected officials. You'll be able to get meetings. You're not going to have to travel all the way to Austin, and you'll be able to get your message in. But what we found is when they did allow people to begin to come into the state capitol, it was easier to try to get some of the more important meetings scheduled face to face. I'm not saying everybody go run out to go and do that. We're coming to the end, but the legislators became extremely inundated with all of the calls and the requests to get to these Zoom meetings. So it has been a difficult time right now navigating both Fed and state pieces. But we're just, everyone is being accommodating to the circumstances that they're both in, but we are still able to make effective requests and ask of our elected officials. And when I said that we bring, you know, volunteers or youth with us, these are some of the examples where they talked about whether it was in youth development or healthy living. These are some specific drawdowns that are showing on the screen here, where we've been able to, in that prep work, know what the data is. So in our child care and after school program, we served X amount of children benefited at number of sites. And then through that, we were able to make sure that the 21st century funding still came through. We didn't do it alone. Many nonprofits across the nation, specifically in collaboration and partnership with the National Council of Nonprofits or After School Alliance, we combine our messaging, we work together, we do sign-on letters together. So it's not one particular entity that is able to get some of this across, but it's all of us working together, knowing what our messages are. Combining that sometimes in a partnership can influence a lot of the decisions. One of the things during COVID and during the CARES Act, a lot of the nonprofits were left out on the relief plans. And so National Council of Nonprofits and others really relied on our nonprofits to engage our volunteer voice, our board volunteers' voices in order to advocate on behalf of these particular bills that would allow nonprofits to benefit from the plans that were being provided to for-profit entities. And so we had to continue to build that case together. So we know that it took almost 9 months for nonprofits that had over 500 employees to be included in some of the benefit plans that were being provided through the 3 different relief plans. So we know that our voice was extremely important to help get dollars down to our local level here so that we could continue to do education type programs, support our essential workers, to do food distributions, to do all of the things that our nonprofits help step into the realm. Most of them stepped into the pandemic serving our communities without knowing how they were going to get reimbursed or if they were going to get reimbursed, keeping their staff safe to step into that. And so those were the messages that we were able to send up to the feds to let them know that here's what we're doing to take care of your community. And in order for us to continue to do that, we need you to help push the legislation through that's going to help benefit us and recover along with all of the other businesses. We'll go to the next one. We don't have our overview yet, but stay tuned. This 87th legislation that we're in currently here in the state of Texas is wrapping up in a couple of weeks, and then in June, July, you'll be seeing all the kind of the reports and the look in the past and see what happens. But this is just an overview in terms of how the Texas State Alliance of YMCAs were able to influence some of the legislation that was passed, make testimonies, and take some of the action steps that help move progress forward for the issues that were important to youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility, or things that really take place with our children and families and the communities we serve. The Texas State Alliance of YMCAs has over 23 YMCAs across the state of Texas. And so this is one entity and one organization that helps to prioritize what's most important, create some talking points and good messaging, and then again, mobilize the efforts between the different CEOs and the different boards that can help influence the policymakers. And one of the things that's most important about the work of the Texas State Alliance is right now, for instance, we are, looking to make sure that there are, as the education dollars come down to the state of Texas from the American Relief Plan, that nonprofits are included with the schools to be able to provide the re-engagement and the reconnection students are going to need as schools open back up, as summer programs are needed this summer as parents go back to work. So 90% of those funds that are coming down from the feds are going to go directly to our local education agencies. We are not going to be able to apply for them independently to the State Board of Education or the Texas Education Agency like we would thought. Everything is going straight to the schools. And so each of our YMCAs or each of our nonprofits in the different cities have to have strong relationships with their ISDs in order to draw those monies down. What's important about the work that we're doing on behalf of the State Alliance and in partnership with the After School Alliance, the Boys and Girls Club, and other out-of-school time entities is we've combined our voice and we are letting our legislators know, our state senators and our representatives know that it's critical for us to be able to receive those funds in conjunction with the schools and the teachers, and that we would like them to use their influence as they work with our school districts and the state agencies to highly recommend that the schools work with our nonprofits. And so that may sound minor, but that is a role of advocacy, because we do need our board members, we do need our CEOs and our executive directors to make sure that our message is very clear, that while we understand that teachers and parents have done a phenomenal job with the hybrid and the virtual learning last year, we know that children have still suffered, that there was an instructional disruption. And so our message is very clear. We want to be a partner. And that's our voice of the advocate, right? We're not asking for a particular piece of legislation to be passed. We're not asking for an appropriation or an allocation. We are asking them to use their influence to make sure that nonprofits are part of the equation in re-engaging our students. Next slide. Kind of went over this already, but again, these slides will be helpful for those that are listening on the webinar, or as you go back and say, what are some of the key practical things? This particular presentation we did with our board members at one of our annual conferences on just becoming an advocate. So, and these are some very, again, grassroots sort of things like, being a participant in your civic clubs, or, that way you can get the message out about what's important to you. What we know about civic clubs are those are committed citizens that are very interested in what happens in their neighborhood. And so what better place to start and recruiting advocates is than in your own neighborhood, right? And people that want to have a better community, and so they're willing to have a voice for it. Again, visit your government website if you don't know who represents you personally, or for the organization where you're working on or behalf of. Make sure you know who are the key representatives, put them on your invitation list, and make sure that you refresh that list every year. And then your one-on-one visits, you can do that through, like today, if we weren't on the virtual and we were in normal times, you would be doing your advocacy days. Next slide. So I say being an advocate is simple. And I only say that because there's a lot of work that someone's doing beforehand in the plan that David alluded to, and making sure that we've done the research and making sure that we know how we're strategizing. But being an advocate, they're just things that we do that are very simple, and it's what we do in our cultivation strategies and our relationship building strategies. So making sure that if you're just starting out, and making sure that your organization or you are making sure that the annual reports, newsletters are getting sent to your elected officials. You're asking your policymakers, to potentially serve or on an advisory board or committee, or even just being a champion. Get them to commit to saying, I want to be a champion for your organization. And that means they're just going to stay engaged and stay in touch with what's happening. Leverage your volunteers. If you have your board chair, or you have some of your volunteers that may live next door to an elected official, or they are in the same business setting or something like that, make sure that you know who your volunteers know. It's just the same way when you present them with a foundation list and the trustees, and you're like, okay, board members for XYZ organization, who do y'all know, right? And so you go through that list and you want to know who knows who. That's the same thing in our nonprofit worlds, and we need to know who knows who, so that if we do need to call on someone to push something forward because our somebody hasn't been able to make the inroads, we want to make sure that they're able to make a direct call to them and ask them to get a meeting set with us if that's needed, or send a personal letter to them on our position or standpoint and saying, dear Representative, Arcos, we want to make sure that this is a priority for our YMCA, and just put that personal note on it with our appeal letter. That makes a big difference a lot of times. And then during the off sessions or the off seasons, make sure that you're inviting the elected officials to come and to visit and tour your facilities or your organization, where they can actually see what you do live. And then also this virtual world that we've been in, it has allowed us to bring our teams together with some of our highest ranking elected officials, bring them in to ask questions, to do small group discussions, but then also to do large town halls. And we invite them to put their message forward, but then we also allow our community to have questions to them, so that we can be recognized for the work that we're doing jointly. And some of the pictures here you'll see at the bottom, that's youth and government, where our teens come in, take over the whole Capitol, and they run the judicial, legislative, and media components. And so that's one of the many elected officials come up through these youth leadership programs. And so knowing whether or not your organization has something else that helps lend and lift up youth, or mentors folks to become advocates or go into public policy, is always key to know. If you're opening up a new facility, or you have someone that's done, hero work or something, make sure you reach out to your elected officials and ask them to help celebrate and recognize the work of your organization, your staff, or your volunteers. They love to do proclamations, and it's also very symbolic for people to receive that type of recognition. And then this one is, again, Youth Voice. This is a representative from AARP meeting with our teens, and you're like, AARP and teens, but we're really talking about intergenerational work. And you never know who's going to end up being in the presence with your constituents or your membership base. But this particular young professional visited about 8 years ago with our teens, and now she's a newly appointed official within Harris County. And so, but she continues to make sure that she's engaging with youth in order to help make sure they know what their opportunities are to use their voice as an advocate for things that are important to them. And then as they develop into either going into college and continuing to use that, but what are the things that are going to affect and impact them most? Next slide. I mentioned this, invite your policymakers so that they can see things that are happening. These are just, again, a few shots, the bottom right there, we have a board member talking to U.S. Congressperson that came out to a park where that park and that community received some funding. And so they're celebrating that big grant that happened. And this volunteer is actively sharing why the work that they're doing is really important. You can see up at the top, let's, lead the fight against hunger. It's a staff and a volunteer there. At the bottom, your organization can use simple statements and they can fill them in, and you can do a social media blast and post. And then here's one where one of our preschools received their certification, and then one of the council members came through to give them a proclamation because they helped elevate the quality of their child care program. So all of these things were part of public policy issues that came into fruition, and we allowed folks to come in and help celebrate that. How can you influence change? Again, take a seat at the table, active members of committees, offer innovative programs, gather your data, make sure you know how many people are being impacted, how, the span of the work that you're doing. And then you can always attend the public hearings. Most of our county, city, your county, state, all of the hearings and the work is being live streamed. So if you're curious about what happens, tune in and you can watch, you can look, you can track what your issues are being discussed, and you can, actually go back and watch them if you weren't able to see them live. And then, again, call to action. If you, if your organization has such an entity like this is where we can ask people to make sure, whether it's our members, whether it's our participants, whether it's our elected officials, whether it's our family, we can ask them to be advocates for our particular organization. This one, allows you to sign up, give your email address, and as legislation action is needed, people need to support something, this is an email blast or a text blast that goes out. It gives you all the template and all the information, and you just have to say that, yes, I want to do this. A lot of times these are customizable so that you can put in your own scenario. For instance, and we're talking about food insecurity. If I wanted to start that off and we knew we were doing food distribution during the pandemic, I may start that off with, I've been a volunteer doing food distribution for the past 9 months in your district, and this is critical. We see the cars and the lines are very long, and that hasn't stopped, period. That's my personal piece that I can customize, and then the rest of the letter is standard. I push send, and it goes to that elected official or their office so that they can begin to recognize what's most important to the community. Next slide. I think that's it. I think the last thing I just want to say, that the most important thing is that you can do is you can have all of these steps and these best practices. I've given Angie some do's and don'ts and some best practices that we use that she can share out. But the most important thing is building these relationships, cultivating the relationships, starting off small, and then building up your stamina. Make sure you do just like you do with if you're making your first time ask, you always take somebody in for the easy yes, right? Because you want to get the yes first and you feel confident. That's the same thing, is bring somebody that knows on your first go round. If you're meeting with elected officials, go with someone that's done it before, watch them, and then you can always practice, right? Just the same way as you kind of practice yourself. Okay, this is how I'm going to go in. This is what I'm going to do. As you go in to meet with a donor, that's the same thing. You can practice with one of your colleagues or your friends about your messaging. So build that relationship. And it's easy if you believe and you know your information. It's easy to share the story. And then they always want to know what they can do to help and be ready to make that ask. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marie. I jotted down a few notes for myself as well. So we do have some time for some questions. So you're welcome to put those in the chat or raise your hand and I can call on you. There were a few comments. I don't know if you were able to see the chat, Marie, but just some aha moments as far as advocacy being storytelling, which again, David, you had mentioned this as well, but not having that fear or being intimidated, or what we're hearing a lot now is, that imposter syndrome, that we belong at that table. We, have a story to tell. So I love that. And let's see, do we have any questions yet.
Yeah, I was just going to mention on that point. I often remind grassroots advocates, I mean, elected officials work for us, and I know we often forget that, and nonprofits are playing a critical role in communities, so it's important for them to understand the impact that your organizations are having at the community level. And so they shouldn't be intimidated whatsoever in going and sharing that story. So I think that's incredibly important to remember.
One of the things I'll share is, on that is like during some of these, hate crime pieces and such, we called the elected officials office and said, in your particular district, are you experiencing or are your constituents calling and is that an issue for you, right? Because we don't want to take a stand on something that's not an issue. So we want to, across the, for instance, the Asian Pacific hate crimes, right? Across the nation a few months ago, there was a call and many people felt they need to take a stance. So the why, obviously, because we work in all communities and we have an international services and a refugee resettlement, our CEO wanted to take a stance, but I was like, well, before we take a stand, here locally in Houston, let's make sure we know what's happening. And so without having a relationship with a couple of the representatives, I just had to call and ask, like, is this an issue for your district? We don't want to say the wrong thing. And so again, we're inviting them to share with us what's important to them. So it's not a one-way street. And I will have to say, I did 18 calls in one day. Don't fall down, David, because that's not the norm of what you're able to do. But because there's nobody at the Capitol that particular day, I was able just to go all day long, got into all of the offices without appointments. I was able to see 5 of the representatives of the 18. Only one was not receiving any visitors or anything, so I just left the packet. And then I did the follow-up with the thank you, and then asked them to sign us up for their newsletter. And then I have them on our list to continue to build my next steps in the stewardship and the cultivating of that relationship. But when I left each of those meetings, I told them, we're neighbors. The YMCA is an extension of what you bring to your community, or XYZ organization is an extension of what you offer and what you have to benefit your community. So we are allies in the work that we do. We want the best for our communities. And so I leave it as us being partners and working collaboratively together, and not us being seen as a vendor or somebody coming in and asking for something. I invite them to be partners in the work that we do together to strengthen communities.
Great. We may only have time for one more question, and I'll ask this to both you, Marie and David. As far as what work can we do in a non-legislative session, as we are already towards the end of this legislative year? Something that I had jotted down was maybe not to advocate always in a time of need, but building those relationships in the off season, just as we would fundraisers. I think one of you all mentioned that, it is just as we would storytell to our fundraisers. So any thoughts on that, on what you do in the off season?
Yeah, I can share some thoughts on that. I think this is actually the perfect time, as we're kind of wrapping up this legislative session, particularly here in Texas. As we've said and Marie shared, I mean, this is a long process. And so to take the time to develop and steward that relationship with elected officials over the next year and a half. And I know that 2023 will be here before we know it. And so it can be as simple as inviting an elected official to one of your community events to help them better understand what you do and the people you serve. And so taking the time to build that relationship. So as you get closer to the next session and have a better understanding of what your priorities are, you've already started to develop that relationship, and you're not going in with an ask as kind of your first introduction to that office.
Great. Marie?
So yesterday when I was leaving Austin, I had my list. These are the things I'm going to do in preparation for next year, right? And so I have think about what the legislative agenda is going to be for 2023. What was important this time? What didn't get passed? What was what did you want to see get passed and what do you want to continue to work with? Find your legislative champions. So in those meetings, figure out who really honed in on what you're doing and offered to help. And then so creating those legislative champions, or just a person that wants to align themselves with your work, right? Advocacy Day 2023, right? Let's get that on the date. Let's see what that's going to look like. Involve, for our youth and government program, involving more of these elected officials or their staff or their interns in that work. More relationship building with our CEOs and executives, right? I mean, they have to have the relationships year after year. And then creating a public policy. For me, it was creating a public policy task force with our volunteers. Board members are asking, we want to see a task force where that you don't just call us when you need us to do that letter, but that we are part of the discussions. We're bringing you to events where these elected officials will be, and vice versa. So I have a list. So those are the things that you can always, and it's never, it's again, back to philanthropy and fun, development. It's a never ending, you never stop cultivating the relationship. So if it's just starting out, then take that next step. If you've already got a good relationship, well, then just take them to that next level. Take them from 5,000 to 20,000 to 50,000 to the 100,000 champions. So
awesome. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you to all of our guests. And I do have a reminder that our session 2 will begin at 2:15. That is the Texas nonprofit sector, economic impact, COVID-19, and building a collective voice. So we want to thank you all again for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon and enjoy the rest of your sessions. Thanks again, David, and thanks again, Marie.
you're welcome.
Thank you.